Hello there, welcome to the channel. Here we share the stories that touch the soul. Don't forget to subscribe. Let's start.
I remember the exact weight of the silence in our bathroom, the way it pressed against my eardrums like water at the bottom of a pool. 8 years. 2,920 days of temperature charts and ovulation strips, and prenatal vitamins that I swallowed like communion wafers, holy and desperate, and ultimately empty. 8 years of watching my husband's face shift from hope to concern to something I couldn't name, something that settled behind his eyes like sediment at the bottom of a river. His name is David. He has kind hands. I need you to understand this about him before anything else. When we met at a gallery opening in Chicago, I was 31, he was 33. Both of us already carrying the quiet bruises of previous relationships that hadn't survived the weight of expectation. He touched my elbow when he spoke to me, not my waist, not my shoulder. My elbow. As if I were something precious and breakable and entirely my own. That touch decided everything. I didn't know it then, but I know it now, in the way you know the architecture of your own grief after you've walked through every room of it. We married in autumn. The leaves were burning. I remember thinking, stupidly, romantically, that this was auspicious, nature itself celebrating our union with fire. We honeymooned in Maine, in a cabin with windows that fogged from our breathing. On the third morning, I woke before dawn and watched him sleep, the slow rise and fall of his chest, and I felt a certainty so complete it bordered on religious. We would make a child here, in this damp cold, with the pine needles scratching at the roof like fingers. I was already pregnant in my imagination. I had been pregnant in my imagination since I was 16 years old, since I first understood that my body could be a doorway, as well as a vessel. The first year passed in the ordinary sweetness of new marriage. We bought furniture. We argued about paint colors. I wanted sage green for the bedroom. He wanted navy blue. And we ended with gray, that compromise color, that color of waiting. I threw away my birth control pills on our first anniversary, flushed them down the toilet in a ceremony that felt both pagan and deeply American. This faith in our own fertility, this belief that conception was simply a matter of wanting hard enough. The second year introduced the vocabulary of disappointment. Not yet. Soon. It'll happen when you stop trying. The words of well-meaning friends, of my mother who had conceived me accidentally at 22, of strangers in online forums who spoke of relaxing, as if fertility were a clenched fist that needed only to open. I learned to hate the word yet. I learned to smile at baby showers with my hands wrapped around paper cups of lukewarm punch, my nails digging crescents into the styrofoam. David held my hand in the car afterward, said nothing, drove us home through streets that seemed suddenly populated by strollers and swollen bellies, by visual proof of other women's functioning bodies. The third year brought doctors. White rooms and paper gowns and the particular humiliation of spreading your legs for strangers who spoke about you in the third person while palpating your most intimate geography. Patient presents with irregular cycles. Husband's sperm count within normal range. Recommend further testing. David came to every appointment. He sat in the corner chair with his knees spread, his hands clasped, his face arranged in an expression of supportive neutrality that I would later recognize as a mask he had learned to wear, a face he put on like a coat, before entering these rooms of female failure. I was the problem. This became clear gradually, then suddenly, the way weather changes in the Midwest. My FSH levels were elevated. My AMH was concerning for age. There were words like diminished ovarian reserve and unexplained infertility, and finally, The quiet death sentence of a reproductive endocrinologist who looked at my chart instead of my face. You might consider donor eggs or adoption. There are many paths to motherhood. I cried in the parking garage. David held me against his chest and I felt his heart beating, steady and unremarkable. The heart of a man for whom none of this was physically required. He could walk away. He could find someone younger, someone whose ovaries hadn't begun their slow retreat. He stayed. He always stayed. This was the narrative I constructed, the story I told myself in the dark when I couldn't sleep. When I lay beside him listening to his breathing and cataloging my own deficiencies. He stayed. Therefore he loved me. Therefore I was worth something despite my broken biology. That was the year I got pregnant. I didn't know it then. I couldn't have known, because the knowledge was stolen from me before I could possess it, wrapped in surgical gauze and discarded with the rest of the medical waste. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm rushing toward the wound before I've shown you the skin that covered it. The ordinary days that passed while something extraordinary grew inside me without my knowledge or consent. It was October. The air smelled of burning leaves and distant winter. I had been experiencing pain in my lower abdomen, a dull ache that bloomed into sharp stabbing during my period, which had grown irregular and heavy, coming sometimes twice a month, sometimes not for 6 weeks. David made the appointment with Dr. Hale, an OB/GYN affiliated with the hospital where his mother had worked for 30 years before retirement. "She's the best," he said. "Mom knows her personally. She'll take care of you." I remember the examination room with its poster of fetal development, the curled embryos at 8 weeks, 12 weeks, 20, each one more recognizably human than the last. I remember Dr. Hale's hands, cold through the latex gloves, pressing into my abdomen. I remember the ultrasound gel, always shockingly cold, and the wand moving inside me while I stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the perforations to distract myself from the intrusion. "There's a mass on your right ovary," Dr. Hale said. She didn't look at me when she said it. She looked at the screen, at the gray and black shadows that meant nothing to my untrained eyes. "A cyst. Quite large. We'll need to remove it surgically. Laparoscopic procedure. Very routine. But it needs to happen soon. It's causing your symptoms." I remember the relief. A cyst. Not cancer. Not endometriosis. Not another reproductive death sentence. Just a cyst. A fluid-filled sac. Something that could be removed and discarded and forgotten. I remember David's face, the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before he smiled, before he took my hand and said, "See? We'll get this fixed and then everything will be normal." His mother came to the hospital, Margaret. I had always called her Margaret, never Mom, at her own request. She had been a labor and delivery nurse before moving to surgical prep, and she moved through the pre-op area with the authority of someone who belonged there more than the patients did. She held my hand while the anesthesiologist explained the risks, his voice a drone of percentages and rare complications. She signed something on a clipboard when my hand was shaking too badly to hold the pen. "There," she said, smoothing my hair back from my forehead in a gesture that felt almost maternal, almost loving. "All taken care of. You'll be fine, dear. You'll be just fine." I woke in recovery with 3 small incisions in my abdomen, each one sealed with surgical glue. The pain was distant, managed by medication that made everything soft and slow. David held my hand. Margaret brought me ice chips. Dr. Hale visited briefly to explain that the cyst had been larger than expected, that they had removed the entire ovary to be safe, but that I still had one left, that I could still conceive, that this was not the end of anything. I believed her. I believed all of them. Why wouldn't I? They were medical professionals. They were family. They were the people who loved me, who wanted the same things I wanted, who had no reason to lie. The years after the surgery passed in the familiar rhythm of hope and disappointment. We tried fertility treatments. Clomid made me cry at commercials. The injections left bruises on my stomach that looked like fingerprints, like someone had been trying to hold me back from something. We did 2 rounds of IUI, each one expensive and humiliating, lying on a table with a catheter inside me while David's sperm, collected in a cup, carried down a hallway, processed and washed and selected, was injected directly into my uterus. Both failed. The second failure coincided with my 36th birthday. I spent the evening in bed with the lights off, listening to David move through the apartment, his footsteps careful, his silence careful, everything about him careful around my brokenness. We stopped trying for a while. Not officially, not with words, but gradually. The way you stop reaching for something on a high shelf when you finally accept that you will never be tall enough. I threw away the ovulation tests. I stopped taking my temperature every morning before rising, before speaking, before being fully awake. I started sleeping in on weekends, letting my body rest from the years of constant monitoring, of treating myself as a machine that simply needed the right calibration. David found Dr. Aris 2 months ago. A reproductive specialist, he said, his voice carrying that particular excitement I hadn't heard since the early years, when every new doctor was a potential savior. He's doing groundbreaking work with hormonal resets, not IVF, something different, something that works with your body instead of against it. He showed me the website on his phone, the sleek professional photographs, the testimonials from women who had tried everything before finding Dr. Aris and his integrated fertility protocol. I was skeptical. 8 years of disappointment had taught me that skepticism was a form of self-protection, a shell that grew thicker with each failed cycle. But David's hope was contagious, the way it had always been. He booked the consultation. He drove me to the appointment himself, took the morning off work, held my hand in the elevator up to the 10th floor of a glass building downtown. Dr. Aris was younger than I expected, with a beard he kept stroking as he spoke, and eyes that seemed to actually see me when I talked. He asked about my history, my surgery, my cycles. He took notes on a tablet, nodding, making sympathetic sounds. The body remembers, he said. Even after the cyst is removed, the body remembers the trauma. We need to reset that memory. Clean slate. He prescribed a protocol of supplements and bioidentical hormones, a special diet, acupuncture twice weekly. Give me 6 months, he said. You'll be amazed. I wanted to believe him. I wanted it so badly that I could taste it, metallic and urgent at the back of my throat. I started the protocol. I cut out gluten and dairy. I lay on acupuncture tables with needles in my ankles and wrists and abdomen, trying to meditate, trying to visualize my ovaries as flowers opening, as doors unlocking, as anything other than what they were. Aging, failing, slowly giving up. The follow-up appointment was last Tuesday. David couldn't come. An emergency at work, a client meeting he couldn't reschedule. I went alone, taking the train downtown, walking through streets that smelled of exhaust and pretzels from street vendors. Dr. Aris's office was in a medical complex, a suite of rooms that smelled of lavender and money. I sat in the waiting area, flipping through a magazine without seeing the pages, until his assistant called my name. Dr. Aris is running a few minutes behind, she said, leading me not to an examination room but to his private office. You can wait in here. He'll be right with you. The office was large, deliberately masculine, dark wood and leather chairs, a desk with nothing on it but a computer and a framed photograph of a woman and 2 children. I sat in one of the leather chairs, then stood, restless, moving to the window to look down at the street 10 floors below. Tiny people, tiny cars, the city continuing its indifferent existence while I waited for a man to tell me whether my body was finally, after 8 years, capable of the one thing I had been designed to do. I turned from the window and my hip caught the edge of the desk. A drawer slid open, just an inch, but enough. I shouldn't have looked. I know I shouldn't have looked. But 8 years of infertility had trained me to search for information, to gather data like a desperate archaeologist sifting through dirt for fragments of pottery. I opened the drawer fully. Files, dozens of them, labeled with names I didn't recognize, and beneath them, a folder with my own name written in David's handwriting. I knew his handwriting the way I knew the sound of his breathing, the particular rhythm of his footsteps, the way he cleared his throat before saying something difficult. We had been married for 11 years. I had opened thousands of his notes, his grocery lists, his birthday cards to me in the early years when he still wrote them by hand instead of signing store-bought sentiments. I knew the slight backward slant of his letters, the way he crossed his T's with a small loop, as if he couldn't quite commit to the finality of a straight line. I opened the folder. Inside was my medical record from 6 years ago. Not a copy. The original, with the blue header of Westside Women's Clinic. The logo I remembered from the examination room where Dr. Hale had told me about the cyst. I had never seen this record. Patients don't typically see their full charts. The notes written in the private language of medical professionals, the observations and impressions that exist behind the curtain of doctor-patient confidentiality. I read it. I read it 3 times, because the first time my brain refused to process the words, and the second time I thought I must be misunderstanding, and the third time I understood perfectly and the room began to tilt around me, the dark wood and leather dissolving into a gray static that buzzed at the edges of my vision. Patient. Elena Voss, 34F, presenting with abdominal pain, irregular bleeding. Ultrasound performed. Intrauterine gestational sac identified, consistent with 5 weeks, 2 days gestation. Fetal pole visible. Cardiac activity detected. Impression: viable intrauterine pregnancy. I was pregnant. 6 years ago, I was pregnant. 5 weeks and 2 days. A fetal pole, cardiac activity. A heart beating inside me that I never knew existed. That was declared a cyst and surgically removed while I slept, while Margaret held my hand and signed papers and told me I would be fine. I kept reading. My hands had begun to shake, but I kept reading, because stopping would mean having to feel what I was feeling, and I wasn't ready for that yet. I might never be ready for that. Procedure performed. Laparoscopic salpingo-oophorectomy with dilation and curettage. Right ovary and fallopian tube removed. Uterine contents evacuated. Specimen sent to pathology. Dilation and curettage. The medical term for abortion. For scraping a uterus empty. They had removed my pregnancy and told me it was a cyst. They had killed my child and called it surgery. At the bottom of the record, a consent form. My signature. Except it wasn't my signature. I stared at it for long minutes, comparing it to the way I wrote my name, the flourish on the E, the loop of the V. This was a forgery. A clumsy one, or perhaps one made in haste, made while I was unconscious, made by someone who didn't care if I ever discovered the deception. Below the forged signature, another name. Witness: Margaret Voss, RN, Margaret, my mother-in-law. The woman who had held my hand and brought me ice chips and smoothed my hair and told me I would be fine. She had been there. She had signed. She had known. The folder slipped from my hands. I don't remember dropping it. I was on my knees on the thick carpet of Dr. Aris's office, surrounded by papers that proved my life had been built on a lie so profound I couldn't yet find its edges, its bottom, its limits. I was making a sound, I realized dimly, a high keening like an animal caught in a trap, and I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop, because stopping would mean silence, and silence would mean having to exist in a world where this was true. The door opened. Dr. Eris stood there, his beard and his sympathetic eyes, and behind him I saw David. David, my husband. The man with kind hands who had found this doctor, who had made this appointment, who had not been able to come today because of an emergency meeting that apparently didn't exist. He was here. He had been here all along, waiting in some other room, and now he stood in the doorway of the office where I knelt among the evidence of our shared lie, and his face. His face was not surprised. It was resigned. It was the face of a man who had known this moment would come, who had prepared for it, who had perhaps been waiting for it with a relief that bordered on exhaustion. "Elena," he said, "let me explain. I don't remember the drive to his mother's house. I must have agreed to go, or perhaps I simply followed him to the car in a daze. A sleepwalker, a woman who had been anesthetized again, this time by shock instead of chemicals. I remember the highway, the blur of trees and billboards, the radio playing something classical that David turned off when he saw my hands clenching in my lap. I remember wanting to open the door and roll onto the asphalt, to let the momentum of the car and the friction of the road erase me, reduce me to something that didn't have to feel this, know this, carry this. Margaret lived in the house where David had grown up, a brick colonial in a suburb that had been fashionable in the 1980s and was now merely respectable. She opened the door before we reached it, as if she had been watching for us, as if she had known we would come. She was 72 now, her hair completely white, her body softened by age into something that looked maternal, grandmotherly, safe. She looked at my face and her own went pale, not with guilt, not with fear, with something else, something that took me longer to identify because I had never seen it directed at me before. Contempt, resignation. The look of someone who had been found out but not defeated, who had been preparing for this confrontation for 6 years and was ready to meet it on her own terms. "You didn't tell her," Margaret said. Not a question, a statement directed at David, who stood behind me on the porch steps. "You said you would tell her. You promised when you married her that you would handle this." "Handle what?" My voice came out strange, hoarse, as if I had been screaming for hours instead of sitting in silence for 20 minutes. "Handle what, Margaret? Handle the fact that you killed my baby? That you signed papers while I was unconscious and let them cut my child out of me?" She didn't flinch. She stepped back from the doorway, gesturing us inside with the automatic hospitality of a woman who had spent her life in the Midwest, who offered coffee and cookies even in the face of accusation, who believed that civilization was maintained through the performance of normalcy. "Come in," she said. "We'll talk inside." The living room was unchanged from every other visit. The same floral sofa, the same framed photographs of David at various ages, the same ceramic figurines on the mantel that had belonged to her mother. I had sat in this room 100 times, for holidays and birthdays and Sunday dinners, and I had never felt unsafe here. I had never understood that I was in the presence of my enemy. "Sit," Margaret said. I remained standing. David sat on the edge of the sofa, his hands between his knees, his head bowed. He looked like a boy awaiting punishment, and something in me, some last residual instinct of protection, wanted to go to him, to comfort him, to tell him it would be okay. I crushed that instinct. I ground it beneath the heel of what I now knew. "Explain," I said. "Both of you. Explain why you decided I didn't deserve to have my baby. Explain why you thought you had the right to make that choice for me." Margaret sat in her armchair, the one by the window that she had claimed as hers decades ago. She arranged her skirt, crossed her ankles, folded her hands in her lap. The posture of a woman preparing to deliver difficult news, a nurse informing a family of a death. She had done this thousands of times in her career. She was good at it. "David came to me," she said, "after your ultrasound. He was distraught. He didn't know what to do. You were so happy, Elena. You were already talking about nurseries, about names, and he knew. He had known since before the wedding, since the genetic testing his father insisted on." "Known what?" The word came out sharp, a blade. Margaret looked at her son, and something passed between them. Some communication that excluded me utterly, that had always excluded me. "David is a carrier," she said, "of Huntington's disease. His father died of it, as you know. What you don't know, what we never told you, is that David was tested in his 20s. Positive for the gene. CAG repeats in the pathological range. He will develop symptoms, probably within the next decade, and any child he fathers has a 50% chance of inheriting the gene." I turned to David. He was still looking at the floor, at the pattern of the rug, at anything but me. "You never told me," I said. It wasn't a question. We had discussed children before marriage. Of course we had. We had discussed health, genetics, family history. He had told me about his father's death, the long decline, the years of watching a strong man reduced to twitching helplessness. He had never mentioned a test. He had never mentioned being positive. "I couldn't," he said, finally looking up. His eyes were wet, but his voice was steady, controlled. The voice he used in business negotiations, in difficult conversations with employees, he needed to fire. "I couldn't bear it, Elena. The look on your face when I told you. The way you would have looked at me differently. As damaged. As a risk. I thought if we just tried, if it didn't work, if the infertility was just natural, then we could adopt. We could find another way, and you would never have to know. So, when I got pregnant," I said slowly, each word requiring enormous effort, "when I actually conceived, against all odds, you panicked. You went to your mother, and you decided to end it. To end me. To take my child and tell me it was a cyst." "It wasn't like that," David said, but his voice lacked conviction, the words falling flat between us. "It was exactly like that," Margaret said. She was calm, terrifyingly calm, a woman who had made her peace with monstrous decisions long ago. "David came to me in tears. He didn't know what to do. He loved you. He loves you. And he couldn't tell you the truth. Not then. Not after you'd already suffered so much with the infertility. And I knew Dr. Hale. I had worked with her for 15 years. I knew she would help us. I knew she understood that sometimes the kindest choice is the one that prevents greater suffering." "Greater suffering?" My voice broke, shattered, reformed itself into something harder. "You mean the suffering of raising a child who might get sick? The suffering of watching your child live a life that might include illness? That's not your choice to make, Margaret. That's not David's choice. That was my child, my body, my decision." "Was it?" Margaret stood, moving to the mantel, to the photographs of David, her fingers touching the frame of one from his college graduation. "You were so desperate for a baby, Elena. You would have kept it regardless of the risk. You would have brought a child into the world knowing it might inherit a death sentence, and you would have told yourself that love was enough, that modern medicine would save it, that you were different, special, exempt from the statistics. I've seen mothers like you. I've watched them care for children who slowly lose the ability to walk, to speak, to swallow. I've watched the children become prisoners in their own bodies, and I've watched the mothers destroy themselves trying to save what cannot be saved. I didn't want that for David. I didn't want that for any grandchild of mine. So you chose, I said. You chose for me. You signed my name, and you chose. I protected my son, she said, turning to face me. And I protected you, whether you can see that or not. You have no idea what Huntington's does to a family, the years of watching someone you love disappear while their body betrays them. The financial ruin, the emotional devastation. David watched his father die for 12 years. Elena. 12 years of slow erasure. He was 20 when it started, 32 when it ended. He missed his entire young adulthood to that disease. And you would have condemned another generation to the same fate? Out of what? Sentiment? Biological imperative? The selfish need to reproduce regardless of consequence? I looked at David. He was crying now, silently, tears tracking down his face without sound, without movement. The man I had loved for 11 years, the man whose hands had touched my elbow at a gallery opening and made me feel seen, chosen, safe. He had known. He had always known. Every time we made love, every time I wept over a negative pregnancy test, every time he held me and promised it would happen, it would work, we would find a way. He had known that he was the reason, that his genes were the barrier, that if we ever succeeded, he would find a way to undo it. Dr. Eris, I said, the connection forming slowly, horribly. He's not a fertility specialist, is he? He's part of this. Part of the lie. David wiped his face with his sleeve, a gesture so familiar it hurt to watch. Dr. Eris is a genetic counselor, he said. He works with families affected by Huntington's. I've been seeing him for 2 years, monitoring my own symptoms. I wanted to tell you, Elena. I kept planning to tell you. But then he found the trial, the new protocol, and I thought if we could just get pregnant now, with pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, with embryo screening, it would be different. It would be safe. I could finally give you what you wanted without the risk. You thought you could replace what you took, I said. You thought you could erase the first child and offer me a second, genetically perfect one, and I would never know the difference. I would never know that I was already a mother, that I had already carried a life, that you murdered it and called it surgery. Don't use that word. Margaret's voice sharpened, the first crack in her composure. Don't you dare use that word. We made a difficult decision in impossible circumstances. We acted out of love. Love? I laughed, and the sound was ugly, broken, nothing like laughter. Love doesn't forge signatures, Margaret. Love doesn't lie for 6 years. Love doesn't let a woman wake up from surgery believing she's defective, believing her body failed her, while secretly knowing that her body worked perfectly and you destroyed what it made. That's not love. That's control. That's theft. That's violence dressed in surgical scrubs. I walked to the door. My legs were steady, which surprised me. I felt as if I were floating, as if the floor had ceased to exist, and I was moving through empty space, sustained only by the momentum of my own rage. Elena, David said, standing, reaching for me. Please, we can work through this. We can what? I turned back, and he flinched from whatever he saw in my face. Can go back to pretending? Can continue your little monitoring appointments with Dr. Eris while I swallow hormones and hope? Can bring another child into this lie, this family, this history of stolen choices and forged consent? No, David. No. We're done. I opened the door. The afternoon light was fading, the sky bruising toward evening. I stepped onto the porch, and Margaret's voice followed me, calm and terrible and final. You would have made the same choice, she said, if you'd known, if you'd really understood what Huntington's means. You would have thanked us. I didn't turn around. I walked down the steps, across the lawn, to my car parked at the curb. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know anything except that the last 11 years of my life had been a performance, a stage set built by people who believed they knew better than me what I deserved, what I could handle, what my life should contain. I drove. The city lights came on around me, indifferent and beautiful. I thought of the child I had never known, the heartbeat I had never heard, the 5 weeks and 2 days of existence that had been classified as pathology and removed while I slept. I thought of the gray bedroom, the compromise color, the years of temperature charts and ovulation strips, and hope that had been, I now understood, hope in a rigged game. Hope that my husband and his mother had ensured would never be fulfilled. I pulled over in a parking lot near the lake. The water was black, invisible against the sky. I rested my forehead on the steering wheel and I wept for everything. For the baby, for the marriage, for the woman I had been this morning who still believed in the fundamental goodness of the people who claimed to love her. I wept until my throat was raw, until my eyes burned, until there was nothing left but the hollow space where grief had lived, a space that I knew would never truly empty, would never heal, would only become familiar over time, a room I would learn to walk through in the dark without stumbling. When I could drive again, I went to a hotel. I used my own credit card, the one David didn't have access to. I lay on the unfamiliar bed and I stared at the ceiling and I tried to imagine a future that didn't include him, that didn't include the house with the gray bedroom, that didn't include Margaret's floral sofa and her ceramic figurines, and her absolute certainty that she had acted from love. I couldn't imagine it, but I knew, with a certainty that settled into my bones like winter, that I would have to learn, that the only way forward was through, and the through was dark, and long, and entirely mine to walk. I thought of something Margaret had said, in the early years, when I was still hopeful, and she was still careful with me. We had been washing dishes together after Thanksgiving dinner, and she had touched my hand with her soapy fingers and said, "You're a good girl, Elena. You want the right things. That's your blessing and your curse." I hadn't understood her then. I understand her now. The right things. Marriage, family, children, love. These were the things I had wanted with a purity that made me vulnerable, that made me trust too easily, believe too completely, see kindness where there was only calculation. My blessing and my curse. The thing that had made me lovable, and the thing that had made me easy to deceive. I fell asleep eventually, the sleep of the exhausted, the traumatized, the newly orphaned from everything she had believed about her own life. I dreamed of a child with David's eyes and my hair, running through autumn leaves, laughing. In the dream, I knew what Margaret had taken from me, and I ran after the child, calling, but the leaves kept falling, burying everything, and I woke with leaves in my mouth, choking, alone in the dark of a hotel room that smelled of industrial cleaner and other people's loneliness. I checked out in the morning. I went to a lawyer. I filed for divorce. I didn't tell David where I was staying, what I was doing, whether I was alive or dead. I let him wonder, the way I had wondered for 8 years whether I was enough, whether I was broken, whether I would ever be whole. The papers were served on a Tuesday. I wasn't there to see his face. I didn't need to be. I had already seen everything that mattered. The resignation, the preparation, the years of waiting for this moment that he must have known would come, that he had perhaps even wanted, in some secret part of himself. Because secrets are heavy things to carry alone, and eventually the carrier begins to hope for discovery, for relief, for the terrible freedom of being found out. Margaret called me once. I let it go to voicemail. She didn't leave a message. She didn't need to. I could hear her breathing, Could imagine her sitting in her armchair by the window, the ceramic figurines watching, the photographs of David on the mantel, her perfect son, her protected son, the son for whom she had committed an unforgivable act and would commit it again, without hesitation, without regret. I moved to a different city. I found an apartment with windows that faced east, that caught the morning light. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in reproductive trauma, who didn't flinch when I described waking up from surgery to a lie, who helped me understand that my grief was real, my anger justified, my body, despite everything, still mine, still capable, still worthy of trust. I never had another child, not because I couldn't, the remaining ovary, the tests that showed I was still fertile, the years I had left, but because I chose not to. Because the desire that had defined my 20s and 30s had been transformed by betrayal into something else, something quieter and more complicated. I didn't want to be a mother anymore, not in the way I had wanted it before. I wanted something else, something I was still learning to name. Sovereignty, perhaps. The right to my own story, unco-opted, unedited, entirely mine. Sometimes I think of that child, the one with the heartbeat, the one that existed for 5 weeks and 2 days before being reclassified as medical waste. I wonder if it would have had David's kindness, his careful hands, his ability to make me feel seen. I wonder if it would have inherited his gene, his death sentence, his mother's protectiveness. I wonder if I would have loved it enough to forgive everything, to accept the lie as the price of its existence, to become complicit in my own deception. I don't know the answers. I will never know. That is the final gift Margaret gave me, the last act of control that extends beyond her reach and into my future. A question that can never be answered, a loss that can never be fully mourned, a life built on a foundation that was demolished while I slept, dreaming of gray bedrooms and compromise, believing that love meant trust and trust meant safety, and safety meant the gentle hands of family guiding you through darkness. I was wrong. I was wrong about everything. And the worst part, the part I carry with me still, is that I don't know if I would have chosen differently than they chose for me. If David had told me the truth, if I had known about the gene, the risk, the 50% chance, would I have kept the pregnancy? Would I have been brave enough, or foolish enough, or simply stubborn enough to insist on my right to my own child, my own consequence, my own grief? Margaret believed I wouldn't. She believed she was saving me from myself, from my own goodness, my own desperate wanting of the right things. And maybe she was right. Maybe I would have made the same choice, eventually, with enough information, enough fear, enough pressure from the medical establishment and the statistics, and the long shadow of David's father's decline. But it would have been my choice. Mine to make, mine to live with, mine to regret or celebrate, or simply endure. That is what they took from me, what can never be returned. Not the child, not the years, not the marriage, but the fundamental right to be the author of my own life, to sign my own name, to wake from anesthesia into truth instead of lie. I am 41 now. I live alone. I have a garden, a cat, a job that doesn't define me but sustains me. I am learning to want different things, smaller things, things that belong entirely to me and cannot be taken or forged or surgically removed. The morning light through my east-facing windows, the smell of soil after rain, the sound of my own breathing, steady and unremarkable, continuing despite everything. David developed symptoms last year, a tremor in his left hand that he couldn't control. The beginning of the long decline his mother feared, that she committed atrocities to prevent him from witnessing in a child. I heard about it through mutual friends, The way you hear about people who have become ghosts, legends, cautionary tales. He moved back in with Margaret. She cares for him now, the nurse with the steady hands and the absolute certainty. And perhaps that is justice of a kind, that she must watch her protection fail, that her son will still suffer what she tried so desperately to prevent, that all her control and all her forged signatures and all her love, dressed in surgical scrubs, could not alter the fundamental truth of genetics, of chance, of the body remembering what the mind tries to forget. I don't visit. I don't call. I have no words for either of them that wouldn't simply reopen wounds that have scarred over, that would serve no purpose but my own temporary satisfaction. I have learned slowly that some grief is too large for revenge, that some betrayals can only be survived, not avenged, not understood, not folded into a narrative of healing and closure and moving on. I keep the medical record in a safe deposit box. I don't look at it often, but I know it's there, the proof of what was done to me, the documentation of a crime that has no legal name, no courtroom, no sentence, but the one I impose by my absence, my silence, my refusal to participate in the fiction of a family that was never anything but a stage set, a performance. A lie told in unison by people who believed they knew better than me what my life should contain. Sometimes, in the early mornings, I place my hand on my lower abdomen, over the scars from the laparoscopy, the 3 small marks that I once believed were the evidence of a cyst's removal. I press gently, feeling the pulse of my own blood, the warmth of my own skin, the persistence of my own life. And I whisper, to the child who never grew beyond 5 weeks and 2 days, to the heartbeat I never heard, to the future that was stolen while I slept. I remember. I know. I am still here. It is not enough. It will never be enough. But it is what I have, what I can offer, what remains when everything else has been taken. My presence, my witness, my stubborn, damaged, surviving self, continuing into a morning light that asks nothing of me but to keep breathing, to keep moving, to keep building a life from the ruins of a lie that was told in the name of love, that was committed with kind hands, that ended everything I believed about myself and left me, finally, alone with the truth. And the truth, I have learned, is not a comfortable thing. It does not warm you in winter or keep you company at night. It does not replace the child or the marriage or the years of hope that now taste like ash. But it is mine. It belongs to me in a way that nothing else in my life ever has, in a way that nothing else ever will. I found it in a drawer that should have been locked, in a record that should have been hidden, in a moment that should have never happened but did, irrevocably, finally, setting me free from a prison I didn't know I was in. I am not grateful for this freedom. I would trade it in an instant for the ignorance, the hope, the continued belief in David's kind hands and Margaret's steady love. But I cannot trade it. I can only live in it, through it, beyond it, one morning at a time, one breath at a time, one scar at a time, until the scars become indistinguishable from skin, until the grief becomes indistinguishable from memory, until I am simply myself again, whoever that is, whoever I might have been if someone had simply told me the truth and let me choose. The gray bedroom is gone. I painted it yellow, the color of daffodils, the color of stubborn life pushing through frozen ground, and then I sold the house and moved away and never saw it again. But sometimes I dream of it, the compromise color, the color of waiting, and in the dream it is empty, the bed made, the windows open, the curtains moving in a breeze that smells of autumn and burning leaves, and something else, something I am still learning to name, possibility, perhaps. the possibility of a different life, a different choice, a different ending to a story that began with a touch on my elbow and ended with a forged signature and a silence that has lasted now for 6 years and will last, I know, for the rest of my life, echoing in the spaces between heartbeats, in the quiet of early mornings, in the yellow light of windows that face east and wait for dawn. I wait with them. I have become patient in my damage, in my survival. I have learned that some things cannot be rushed, cannot be fixed, cannot be replaced with newer, better, genetically screened versions of themselves. Some things can only be endured, witnessed, carried like stones in the pocket of a coat that grows heavier with each step, but never quite heavy enough to stop the walking, the moving forward, the relentless continuation of a life that was supposed to be different but isn't. That was supposed to contain children and grandchildren and the ordinary happiness of family but doesn't. That contains instead only this: me, alone, scarred, awake, and finally, telling my own story in my own voice, with my own name signed at the bottom, the real signature, the authentic mark, the proof that I exist, that I remember, that I am still here despite everything they took, everything they tried to erase, everything they believed they could control and contain and ultimately destroy. They were wrong. I am still here. And that, in the end, is the only victory available to me, the only justice, the only truth that matters. I survived their love. I survived their protection. I survived the surgery and the lie and the 6 years of believing I was broken when I was whole, and I emerged, damaged but intact, into a morning that belongs entirely to me, that asks nothing of me but to keep breathing, to keep being, to keep telling this story until it becomes part of the larger story, the human story, the endless chorus of voices saying, I was here, this happened to me, I remember, and someone, somewhere, will hear. Someone will read these words and recognize their own scar, their own silence, their own stolen choice, and they will know that they are not alone, that the crime committed against them has a name, even if the law doesn't recognize it, that their grief is real and their anger is justified, and their body, despite everything, is still theirs, still sacred, still capable of healing in ways that no surgeon can predict or prevent or forge away with a pen and a signature and a mother's absolute, terrible, unforgivable love. This is what I have to offer. This is what remains. Not a child, not a marriage, not the future I imagined in a cabin in Maine with fogged windows and pine needles scratching at the roof. Only this, my voice, my witness, my survival. Only this, and the hope, faint, stubborn, refusing to die completely, that it might be enough, that it might matter, that someone, somewhere, might read these words and finally, understand. I was pregnant. I didn't know. They took it from me while I slept, and told me I was empty, and I believed them for 6 years. And now I know, and now I tell you, whoever you are, in the hope that knowing might be its own kind of freedom, its own kind of justice, its own kind of love, the real kind, the honest kind, the kind that doesn't forge signatures or perform surgery without consent or protect anyone from the truth of their own choices. The kind that simply says, I see you, I hear you, you are real, you matter. And what was done to you was wrong, was wrong, was wrong, and no amount of love, no amount of protection, no amount of desperate, fearful, controlling care can ever make it right. I see you. I hear you. I am you. And we are still here, despite everything, breathing in the yellow morning light, waiting for nothing in particular, carrying our stones, telling our stories, surviving. This is the end. This is the beginning. This is everything I have, and everything I am, and everything I will ever be. A woman who woke up from anesthesia into a lie and spent 6 years believing it. And one terrible, beautiful, irrevocable afternoon discovering the truth, and the rest of her life learning to live with it, to tell it, to let it transform her from someone who wanted the right things into someone who simply wants to be real, to be whole, to be free. I am free. It doesn't feel like I thought it would, but it is mine. And that, in the end, is enough. It has to be enough. And so it is.